This is lecture 5, and we're going to finish off the discussion of theories of economic growth and move into geography, health, and development in the about 20 minutes or so into the lecture, something like that. I was going to pass out problem set 1 today, but because we are a little behind and because I want to get into the material a little bit more, I'll pass it out on Thursday. It'll still be a week from when I hand it out, but I think you guys will be in a little better position to dive right into it on Thursday relative to today. Any questions before I get started on today's material? Okay, so we ended up lecture last time trying to think through how Asian economic development may be affecting or may have affected African economic development. We discussed these different potential channels. There's the sort of potential diversion of foreign direct investment from Africa to Asia that could have affected Africa. But at the same time, economic growth in Asia could open up new opportunities for Africa. So there's this potential trade-off between different channels with different effects on African development. And we formalized this last time through our discussion of capital accumulation in a sort of basic Solow type framework by assuming that there's a certain amount of capital, say X, that comes from abroad. So we were sort of breaking with the assumption we've been making so far that all capital accumulation is internal and there are no international capital flows, and allowing there to be a certain amount of foreign investments per year that's possible, X. And if a particular country receives this sort of net investment of X in a given year, it alters the solution to the Solow model in a way that's very similar to having less depreciation. So if there's less depreciation, the blue curve shifts down and steady state level of capital shifts to the right. So basically you end up with more capital because of these infusions, which makes sense. Anything that leads you to get more capital every year will lead to a higher steady state level of capital given a fixed savings rate. Now, of course, in reality, this model is assuming away a lot of things, and a lot of interesting dynamics. We discussed the Allman-Young paper last time, and sort of all the intricacies there. But one possibility for an economy that's receiving a lot of foreign investment is it could affect the level of domestic savings and domestic investment. So you can imagine a foreign investment could substitute for domestic investment and just lead to lots of extra consumption. And that's actually something that is often discussed during periods when particular countries receive big infusions of capital. Is it being invested wisely, or are people basically just consuming this extra investment? In the model as laid out here, we're assuming that the domestic savings rate, which is also the investment rate, stays fixed. So that isn't changing, and there's this just extra amount of capital you get from foreign investment. Now, how does this very, very stylized way of thinking of foreign investment relate to patterns of African and Asian development? I think this is where we left off last time. Imagine a world in which there is this floating pool of international capital that's just looking for high returns. It's just looking to invest in places that basically here in this model have high A's, so they can go and make a big return. Think back to the early 1980s. So the early 1980s, income levels are very similar in, say, China and sub-Saharan Africa on average. We discussed last time how as you get richer, every additional unit of capital is less productive. But both of these are very poor regions. Capital should have a big return as long as A is sufficiently high. And now imagine, out of the blue, Chinese institutions and policies improved dramatically, which they basically did with the end of what you could think of as very extreme communist policies in the late 70s. So at that point, all of a sudden, China becomes a much more attractive investment destination. And this mobile international capital X is going to be drawn to China. There's a high return because of low K. Now there's a high return because of a higher A. And China ends up capturing this capital. So in some sense, you could think of a world or a model where the developing country, the sort of low capital intensity country with the best institutions, the highest A, could end up capturing the lion's share of global capital. There's really something that looks a lot like a zero-sum game between developing regions when they're competing for international capital. So in that simplest sort of model, improvements in institutions in China and India could very directly hurt sub-Saharan Africa. Instead of all this extra floating foreign investment going to Africa, it's all going to Asia. And that's a way in which the rise of Asia might have hurt African development. So maybe that timing of Africa's growth collapse, or at least growth stagnation, starting in, say, the mid to late 70s, maybe it's not entirely coincidental that that's right around the time you see major economic reforms in China, and then in the early 80s you start seeing more important economic reforms in India all the way through the early 90s. So it's just a conjecture, but there's something to it potentially. There's something worth thinking about there. So this is the sort of winner-takes-all point that's on this slide. Now, fast forward a couple decades, we've talked about a lot of the changes in sub-Saharan Africa in terms of democratization. If democratization, as we'll talk about this term, if democratization and political change helps breed better policies, more secure property rights, less corruption, anything that you can imagine would attract foreign investment, all of a sudden A in sub-Saharan Africa looks a lot higher. And maybe sub-Saharan Africa all of a sudden can start competing with Asian countries for foreign investment. Now there's two different things going on here. Over time, over the last few decades, not only have the A's evolved, say, in sub-Saharan African countries and Asian countries, but K's are much higher now in Asia. So with China being much richer, and increasingly India and other Asian countries being much richer, the return to that additional unit of capital in Asia doesn't look as high as it is in sub-Saharan Africa according to the production function that we've laid out. So the combination now of increasing prosperity in Asia and improving A's, or institutional quality policies, et cetera, in sub-Saharan Africa, are increasingly making sub-Saharan Africa look like an attractive investment destination. So again, changes in Asia should affect sub-Saharan Africa if there's a relatively fixed pool of investment capital. Yeah.
It seems like the level of capital being done to, because as Asia grows, the amount of investment being done there.
Exactly. So exactly the point. And again, perfect timing as we plotted out just before lecture. So in the long run, the rise of China and India, exactly as you said, should increase X. So there's a couple things going on in the short run, in the 80s and 90s, in this dark period where institutions didn't look that great in Africa and there was more of a zero-sum game. The rise of Asia might have actually hindered African development. Now, China is itself becoming a major investor in African countries. So the pool of funds has expanded. Beyond that, rapid growth in China and India is, by all accounts, helping to push up global commodity prices. And that's been true since about 2002 or so. Global commodity prices have been very high, say for petroleum and lots of minerals, driven by this incredible demand for minerals, fuel, agricultural commodities, largely in Asia. If you're a producer in Africa of those commodities, you like high prices. You're not if you're a net consumer, right? So if you're a net petroleum consumer, you don't like the high prices, but if you're one of Africa's many oil producers, that's great for you. So the rise of Asia can affect Africa now in a number of ways, and probably at this point, continued economic growth and expansion in Asia on net is going to have positive effects on African development because of the point raised here, as well as due to commodity prices. And just to sort of illustrate this, these are Chinese overseas sort of outward direct investment or foreign direct investment flows over time. And you can see that till the sort of mid-2000s, they were zero, basically. But the picture has just changed extremely rapidly, and that sort of plot continues to skyrocket in recent years. So there's just a lot of foreign investment coming out of China now. Let me pause for a second. Can people think through other channels through which Asian development would either help hinder or promote African economic development?
Yeah, what about prices of goods? China can export very cheap prices rather than having them be in Europe and other.
So you're thinking that as a benefit for consumers in Africa, right? So to the extent that just like American consumers consume many commodities produced in China because they're cheap and basically decent quality, maybe not super high end in terms of a lot of manufactured goods at this point. They'll become higher quality going forward, presumably, but they're very cheap. African consumers can benefit as well from Asian economic growth in that way. So if you buy shoes or bicycles or plates or other kind of everyday goods in most of sub-Saharan Africa, odds are they're made in China, and that'll benefit consumers. Now there's a flip side to that. Maybe someone can think of the flip side to that in the back.
Well, yeah, as Chinese for speed, they're looking for improving the salaries,
That's right. So at this point, if, as there seems to be an indication of, if wages in China are actually increasing now, they won't be able to produce for long these cheaper goods, and that would hurt African consumers, as they would consumers elsewhere, because they won't be able to buy goods for as cheaply as they did before. But it does open up the possibility that some of the manufacturing industries in China today would eventually migrate to sub-Saharan Africa. And we talked about population changes a couple lectures ago. We talked about how Chinese population is going to get older extremely quickly, and it's going to start dropping soon. China in 20 years is going to be a lot like Japan, like a very old country. And sub-Saharan Africa as a region is very young. So in terms of working age population, sort of workers that are going to produce these sorts of relatively cheap manufactured goods going forward, sub-Saharan Africa may be the workshop of the world 20 or 30 years from now, the way China is right now. So there's another hand up. Yeah.
I wonder to what extent that Chinese households would repatriate the profits associated with these development households. In addition to that, I wonder if I've read that Chinese investment in Tornado State, they are staying in there at the funding condition that it's completely built by Chinese workers. But I didn't know if that's the way
There are different cases in sub-Saharan Africa. There are some high-profile projects with Chinese workers. There are many Chinese investment projects in sub-Saharan Africa with African workers as well. So I think it's a bit of a mixed picture. You asked the question about repatriation and sort of what happens when profits are earned off these investments. It kind of relates to the point that was raised in the last lecture. As well, we're not really dealing with distribution here in terms of who's going to benefit from this growth. That is, of course, a key issue and one that we sort of abstracted away from in this model. We're really looking at the size of the pie, but it's obviously a critical issue. So the nature of the deals that African governments or companies can negotiate with Chinese partners is going to be very important for understanding any sorts of welfare gains that might accrue to Africans. Okay, lots of hands. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so the vast majority of African exports to China are minerals and fuels. I think it's like 90-something%. I thought I put a plot up. Did I not put a figure up on that? I'll put it up in another lecture. So the vast majority of Chinese exports into Africa are manufactured goods, and the vast majority of African exports to China are fuels like petroleum and minerals. And it's almost as stark a case as you will see that it's basically manufactured goods for raw materials. That's really the way to think about it. And the level of African exports to China has just skyrocketed. There's been so much Chinese sort of purchases of minerals, fuel, et cetera, partially fueled by this investment. So a lot of the Chinese investment, say minerals in mines, in copper mines in Zambia or something, is motivated by this demand for these minerals in China. So Chinese very often state-owned enterprises make these investments in mines. So that's really the nature of the trade between China and Africa right now. Yeah. Yeah, so on the second point, it gets to this distributional question. So let's say there is oil production in a particular country. Oil prices are high, oil exports are high. Is that going to translate into improved standards of living? It doesn't have to. And so you pointed out why. Those profits could basically stay in the hands of a very small number of people. And there are famous cases in sub-Saharan Africa going back decades. Nigeria is the most famous case of countries that are very large-scale petroleum producers where the benefits of that oil production for the population in terms of public investments and other things is seen to be rather minimal. So it's a major political economy issue. Maybe later on the term we'll have more of a chance to go into this. I'll mention one case now. The kind of most famous example in recent years of this sort of phenomenon is Chad, of this case or this question. So Chad is a great example of what happens when an African country finds mineral wealth. So Chad, like 12, 15 years ago, had big oil finds. And the question, since Chad is landlocked, and maybe we can get to I think I have a map here. Well, you can't really make it out too well, but Chad is, I can't reach. I'm not tall enough, and the laser pointer isn't working. So if I jumped really high, straight up, there'd be a yellow country there, just to the left of the purple country, which is Sudan. Can people that's Chad. Okay. I should have a stool. That'd be awesome if I could just get up there. So Chad had a big oil discovery 15 years ago, but they're landlocked, as you can see. And the question is, they have oil. How are they going to get oil out of Chad? So with Nigeria, it's easy. Nigeria has large ports of its own. Nigeria produces oil, and they export it. Tankers come up right to their ports. And the question facing international agencies with Chad was, should, say, the World Bank subsidize the construction, the large infrastructure loan, the construction of a pipeline out of Chad to a port in Cameroon? And you just run up against this question. Will Chad, and most importantly, will Chadians benefit from having all this oil? And the solution the World Bank came up with was, yes, we will offer these billions of dollars in subsidized loans and loan guarantees and all these other things to build the pipeline, but we're going to insist on a very strict governance setup and regulatory and monitoring and oversight setup where there's basically a committee that's going to have a lot of power to decide how all this oil revenue is going to be used. And in particular, there's going to be a big emphasis in spending all these oil revenues on health and education and various public investments. So that sounded great. And the leader of Chad at the time, who's still the leader of Chad, is President Deby, who's been in power for decades, agreed to these conditions. Said, okay, that sounds fine to me. the pipeline was built, the oil's been flowing, and very shortly after the oil started flowing, he effectively disbanded that oversight committee. They have almost no say over what goes on using Chad's oil revenues. And there's no way that the World Bank or the funders can sort of intervene in Chad and say, well, you broke a deal, like it's a sovereign country. So, he was way too smart for the World Bank in a certain way. I mean, like, oh, these are great conditions, of course I'll agree, knowing very well that he would sort of have the authority to back out. So, and Chad has still some of the worst human development measures in the world. So it's a very current issue. And the big increases in mineral prices, and petroleum prices, and all this new investment the last few years in mines and offshore oil drilling, natural gas drilling, and whatnot throughout sub-Saharan Africa makes this issue really one of the leading current issues. Did you have your hand up? Yeah. 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 I don't have that broken down. I will say, though, that just based on my reading and other sort of reading of the situation, I think a lot of the investment in sub-Saharan Africa, of course this is global, this is Chinese investment globally, not just Africa, but a lot of investment in sub-Saharan Africa is going into minerals and fuels, so sort of raw materials, and in infrastructure like transportation infrastructure. So I think there are parallels. So again, if I'm a Chinese state-owned enterprise investing in a mine, I also will benefit from having a good railroad or road or helping to invest in a port upgrade, which will help me get my product out of the country. So I think those would be the sectors where there's very high-profile Chinese investment, infrastructure and raw materials. Sometimes it's just literally private sector investment, and then there's separate but interlinked government foreign aid. And that's not too different from how European or U.S. Foreign aid often works, but there's both. So there's private investment, buying firms, and doing private sector firms too, that often comes hand in hand with government assistance for countries that are sort of on board the project of getting lots of Chinese investment. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that was a little bit of what I was getting at before when we talked about consumers and sort of, there's an upside to consumers of having cheap Chinese manufacturers. At the same time, local producers could suffer from that competition, which you would see in the U.S. as well. U.S. textile production is down massively over the last 20 years, in large part because of Chinese competition. So there are distributional consequences of China's rise, even beyond the effects on overall production. So I think that's an important issue. I want to circle back a little bit to this issue, which folks were coming back to about the effect of mineral finds in Africa, and some of this mineral production is driven by Chinese investment. A very interesting comparison would be between, say, Chad and Ghana. So Chad discovered oil, and they built this pipeline I talked about, which basically hasn't had the effect that the World Bank and other investors wanted it to have. Ghana is a different case. Ghana also has massive, in their case, offshore oil and gas finds that have just come online basically recently. The investment has been going on for a number of years. But different sub-Saharan African countries may react very differently to these sorts of finds or to this sort of investment. So Ghana has one of the most robust democracies in sub-Saharan Africa. They've had, I think, 4 or 5 peaceful democratic elections. There have been multiple shifts in power between different parties over the last 15 years. And I think most observers feel like, in some sense, the odds that these fuel finds, the natural gas and oil finds, petroleum finds, will benefit the local population are just much higher in Ghana than they would be in Chad. There's a lot of scrutiny, not by outside committees or advisory committees set up by the World Bank, but by voters and citizens who can vote a government out of power if they feel like they haven't used these resources well. And that's a big difference. So the degree of democratic accountability and the strength of democratic institutions has to be an important part of the story. So this is another example of how the reality in different sub-Saharan African countries can be extremely different when it comes to their political institutions. And it's hard to say, oh, mineral finds are going to be good or going to be bad for the population. It's going to vary a lot based on the country. Okay, let me pause for another second and see if there's any last thoughts about the upsides and downsides. You guys have raised a lot of good issues. Yeah. Oh. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We're going to talk about volatility later on in lecture day. We're going to look at weather volatility, which is another form of volatility, and think about how households or countries could react to it. And when we get to that slide, and you'll recognize that slide because it has lines going like this, then we can talk about if it isn't weather that's volatile, prices that are volatile, what would be similar and what would be different. So maybe in half an hour we'll get there. You had your hand up over there. Yeah, so there's been very high-profile cases of commercial agriculture, basically land purchases for commercial agriculture in many countries. And once again, several of the countries where these sorts of purchases have either occurred or there have been attempts to make these purchases have been some of the countries that have less democratic accountability, which raises all the same issues about how the local population will fare in those circumstances. And we're going to come back to it again and again in the course that a certain sort of policy or a certain sort of mineral find or a certain sort of phenomenon can have very different consequences in a democracy and a non-democracy. And given how much divergence there is right now between, there's a lot of democratic African countries and still a lot of dictatorships, the consequences will be very different. So it's a very important point, and it's something that has raised alarm bells. So you have growing populations, growing land scarcity, and could these big commercial land purchases sort of exacerbate food insecurity? It's a first order issue. Yeah.